There's a truth about money that most people actually never realize. If you're around 35 years old and your household income is somewhere between $90,000 and $120,000, you probably feel like you're doing okay. Not behind, not ahead, just somewhere in the middle. But statistically, there's a very real chance you're not where you think you are. And this is where it gets really uncomfortable because you don't actually know if you're ahead, average, or quietly falling behind. Not by age, not by income, and definitely not when you factor in real wealth. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly where you stand at age 35, 40, 45, 50, and even 55 and beyond across both here in Canada and the US, so you can stop guessing and finally see where you stand. So if you're around 35 years old, this is where the gap actually begins. Not in a big and obvious way, but quietly and in the background. Alright, so let's look at what's actually typical. Looking at Canada first, at 35, the median gross household income sits at around $100,000 to $110,000, and the median net worth is roughly around $300,000 to $350,000. So if you're somewhere in this range, you're not behind, you're just right in the middle. Now, if we look at the US, their median gross household income is around $75,000, and the median net worth comes in around $135,000 to $150,000. So across both countries, the story is pretty similar. And most people at 35, they're doing okay on paper. And this is where most people stop, and they see these numbers, and they assume they're doing okay. Now, in Canada, the top 10% net worth at this age sits at around $1.2 million to $1.4 million. And in the US, it's roughly around $900,000 to $1.1 million. Same age, but completely different outcomes. So the real question is what's actually creating this gap? So let's make this real. Take a typical household. Let's say David and Emily. They're earning about $110,000 a year with a net worth of around $325,000. So again, right around the median. But here's what their situation usually looks like. Income is growing, but so are their expenses. And most of their money is tied up in housing. Saving is inconsistent, and overall, progress, it feels slower than expected. They're building, but it doesn't feel like it. Now, compare that to someone in the top 10%. At this stage, they're sitting closer to $1.3 million in net worth. They created margin earlier. They kept more of what they earned, and their net worth grows faster each year. And that momentum, it's already building. And this is the part you can actually start to feel because their numbers, they're already starting to pull away. And now you can actually see it. The gap isn't income, it's how much of it is actually being turned into net worth. And at 35, the gap, it's actually just starting. And by 40, it actually becomes harder to ignore. So let's take a look at what actually happens next. By the time you hit 40, this is where things really start to change and fast. Not just in income, but in how your financial life actually feels. Because at this stage, the gap, it isn't just subtle anymore. Let's start again with what's actually typical. Looking at Canada, by 40, the median gross household income moves up to around $110,000 to $125,000, and net worth sits between $500,000 and $550,000. Now in the US, the median gross income is about $85,000, and the net worth comes in at around $250,000 to $300,000. So on paper, things are improving. Income is higher and net worth, it's growing. But this is where people, they start to actually feel it. Because even though the numbers, they're going up, so is everything else. Expenses, responsibilities, pressure. And for a lot of people, it starts to feel really tight. Now, look at the top 10%. In Canada, the net worth jumps up to around $2.3 million to $2.6 million. And in the US, it's sitting between $1.6 million to $1.9 million. So same age, but now that gap is actually pretty massive. So what's actually happening here and why is it pulling away so quickly? So let's go back to David and Emily. Now at 40 years old, they're earning around $120,000 a year and their net worth has grown to about $525,000. So again, they're doing what most people would consider doing well. But here's what their reality often looks like now. Income has increased, but so has lifestyle. Housing and family costs are now the dominant expense. Saving still happens, but it's not consistent. And investments, they exist, but they're not fully optimized. And overall, their net worth, it's growing, but slowly. They're progressing, but it still feels tight. Now compare that to someone in the top 10%. At this stage, they're sitting closer to about 2.5 million in net worth. Margin was built earlier and protected, and a higher percentage of income was consistently invested over a long period of time, and their investments have been compounding for years now. And lifestyle, it stayed controlled even when their income increased, and their net worth is compounding faster each year. And this is where it really starts to become obvious. That gap is no longer subtle, it's actually visible. And at 40, that gap moves faster than most people expect. And by the time you hit 45, this gap, it doesn't just accelerate anymore. It actually starts to feel permanent. So let's take a look at what happens next. By the time you hit 45, this is where it really starts to sink in. Not just financially, but mentally as well. Because now you can actually see the gap clearly. So let's start again with what's typical. Now in Canada, by 45, the median gross income sits at around 120,000 to 135,000, and net worth comes in at around 650,000 to 750,000. Now in the US, the median gross income is about 115,000 to 120,000, and net worth is roughly about 325,000 to 400,000. So again, on paper, this looks solid. Income is strong, net worth is grown. But this is where something starts to shift, because at 45, people start doing the math. They look at where they are and where they thought they would be. And for the first time, that gap, it feels real. Now let's look at the top 10% in Canada. The net worth jumps to around 3 million to 3.4 million. And in the US, it's between 2.2 million and 2.6 million. Same age, same timeline, but now completely different outcomes. So what does that actually look like in real life? Let's go back to David and Emily. Now at 45, they're earning around 130,000 a year, and their net worth has grown to about 700,000. And again, they're not doing anything wrong, but here's what their reality often looks like. Income looks strong, but costs are heavier. Housing, kids, and lifestyle, they take up more than expected. Retirement savings exist, but they may feel behind. And their net worth, it's growing, but their pressure hasn't gone away. They're not failing, but the gap is now visible. Now compare that to someone in the top 10%. At this stage, they're sitting closer to 3.2 million in net worth. They protected their margin through their 40s, not just earning more. Their assets are now doing more of the work. Now their lifestyle stayed below their capacity, even though their income increased. And because of that, their net worth is now moving at a pace that's very hard to catch. And this is the shift. That gap, it isn't quiet anymore. It's clear. At 45, that gap, it stops hiding. Because by the time you hit 50, this is where it actually starts to feel real. Not just numbers on a screen, but real decisions, real timelines, and real consequences. Because now you don't just see the gap, you actually feel it. So let's start again with what's typical. Now in Canada, by 50, the median gross household income is around 115,000 to 130,000, and the net worth comes at around 850,000 to 1 million. Now in the US, the median gross income is about 110,000 to 120,000, and the net worth is roughly 375,000 to 475,000. So again, these are strong numbers. Income is solid and net worth is approaching 7 figures. But this is where the emotional shift actually starts to happen. Because at 50, time, it starts to feel different. There's less room for trial and error and less room to recover from mistakes. And for a lot of people, this is where financial pressures become more noticeable, not less. Now let's look at the top 10%. In Canada, the net worth jumps to around 3.8 million to 4.4 million. And in the US, it's between 3 million and 3.6 million. Same age, but now completely different levels of flexibility. So what does that actually feel like in real life? Let's go back to David and Emily. Now at 50 years old, they're earning around $125,000 per year, and their net worth has grown to about $875,000. And again, they've built something. But here's what their reality actually looks like right now. Income may be strong, but time, it feels shorter. The mortgage, it's further along, but cash flow, it still matters. Retirement is no longer abstract. It's actually starting to feel real. And mistakes, they're harder to recover from. They've made progress, but they're still feeling that pressure. Now, compare that to someone in the top 10%. At this stage, they're sitting closer to $4.1 million in net worth. Their assets are now carrying more of the weight, not their income. Debt is typically lower and even more controlled, and compounding has had decades to work. And because of that, financial decisions, they feel less urgent. And this is where something really important happens. Their wealth starts creating breathing room. So at 50, the gap, it actually feels real. And by the time you hit 55, this gap doesn't just affect how you feel. It actually starts determining what's actually possible. So let's take a look at what actually happens next. By the time you hit 55, this is where it stops actually being theoretical. It's not just numbers on a screen anymore. It's not even just projections, but it's actual real life decisions. Because at this stage, you're no longer building from scratch. You're working with what you've already built. And this is what makes this moment so important. So let's start again with what's typical. Now in Canada, by 55, the median gross income sits at around $95,000 to $115,000. And net worth comes closer to around $1 million to $1.2 million. Now in the US, the median gross income is about $80,000 to $90,000, and net worth sits around $450,000 to $575,000. So on paper, this still looks like progress. Many people have crossed that 1 million mark, but this is where that shift, it becomes real. Because by 55, income is no longer your main driver. Your ability to sustain your lifestyle starts depending more on your assets than your actual paycheck. And if your assets aren't strong enough or you haven't accumulated enough, this is where people start to feel exposed. Now, let's look at the top 10%. In Canada, the net worth jumps to around $4.5 million to $5.2 million. And in the US, it's between $3.8 million and $4.5 million. It's the same age, but now you're looking at two completely different paths. So what does that actually look like in the day-to-day? So let's go back to David and Emily. Now at 55 years old, they're earning around $105,000 a year. Now their net worth is about $1 million. And again, they've done a lot of right things. But here's what their reality actually looks like now. Income may start flattening, and their net worth matters more than their paycheck. And retirement planning becomes unavoidable, and flexibility depends on what they built earlier. Now they've made progress, but they don't actually feel freedom just yet. Compare that to someone in the top 10%. Now, at this stage, they're sitting closer to $4.8 million in net worth. Work starts to become optional and not mandatory. Assets are now doing the heavy lifting. Now, debt is often reduced or completely gone. Now, decisions, they feel calmer because there's actual margin. This is where the difference becomes absolutely undeniable. Their money is creating options for them. And at 55, this gap actually becomes a fork in the road. And by the time you hit 60, this fork turns into something permanent. Because at this point, if you're no longer choosing a direction, you're basically living with the results. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like. By the time you hit 60, this is no longer a projection. This is the actual outcome, not what could happen and not what might happen, but what actually happened. Because at this stage, your financial life isn't being built anymore. You're actually living it. So let's start one last time at what's actually typical. Now in Canada, by 60, the median gross income sits at around $75,000 to $95,000. Now the net worth comes in at around $1.1 million to $1.25 million. Now in the US, the median gross income is about $70,000 to $85,000, and net worth sits at around $500,000 to $650,000. So on paper, this still looks like stability. But this is where the meaning of those numbers changes, because at 60, Income is no longer the focus. What matters more now is whether your assets can support your life, whether your money can generate income, or you still need to go out and work. And that difference changes absolutely everything. Now let's look at the top 10%. In Canada, the net worth sits at around 5 million to 5.8 million. And in the US, it's between 4.3 million to 5.2 million. Same age, but now completely different realities. So what does that actually look like? Let's go back to David and Emily. Now at 60 years old, they're earning around $85,000 a year, and their net worth is about $1.1 million. They've made it this far and they've built something. But here's what the reality often looks like now. Income is no longer the main driver, and assets need to support the next chapter of life. Debt and spending matter even more than ever, and their peace depends on how much margin they have. Look, David and Emily, they've made progress, but now sustainability is what matters. Now compare that to someone in the top 10%. At this stage, they're now sitting closer to like 5.4 million in net worth, and assets are providing income and flexibility. Retirement is planned and it's not guessed. They can reduce work without panic, and their wealth is now usable. And this is the key difference. Their money is no longer just growing, it's actually supporting their life. And at 60, the gap becomes the outcome. And this is why what you do in your 30s and in your 40s and in your 50s matters more than what most people actually realize. Because by the time you actually get here, you're no longer catching up. You're actually living with what you built. So the real question becomes, which side are you moving towards right now? And if you're sitting there right now thinking, okay, but where do I actually stand, like overall? Not just by age, but across the full entire spectrum. The top 25%, the top 10%, the top 5%, and even the top 1%. Then you need to go watch this next video. I break down the entire wealth ladder across both Canada and the US so you can clearly see where you fall and what it actually takes to move up. Because once you understand the full distribution, this whole conversation starts to click. So stay humble, stay in the black, and I'll see you in the next one.